A lonely woman took in an injured dog, but soon it led her to an abandoned mine. There in the darkness, the woman stumbled upon something that changed her life forever. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. Marta lived where the town gave way to wilderness, on a stretch of dirt road that most people no longer bothered to walk. Her house, once built with care by her husband's hands, had grown tired with the years. The roof sagged in places where shingles had come loose during storms, and the paint had long ago surrendered to weather and wind. The fence that encircled the property leaned as if it too had given up. When dusk fell, the house became a shadow at the edge of Copper Hollow, a lonely reminder of days when the town bustled with life and families laughed on porches. Now few even passed by. For Marta, silence had become her only companion. Her husband had been a miner, like nearly every man in Copper Hollow. The mine had swallowed their lives, given them bread and coin, but demanded a price in return. When the accident happened 5 years earlier, the cave-in that took a dozen men, Marta's husband had been among them. His name, John Morrison, was carved on a stone marker near the cemetery. But for Marta, the stone was only a reminder that the world could bury not just bodies, but futures too. She had never remarried, never even considered it. John had been her anchor, and when he was gone, she drifted to the edges of town where no one looked too closely at her anymore. Life in Copper Hollow had only worsened after the mine shut down. At first, the closure was temporary, a safety measure until inspections could be carried out. But weeks became months. Months turned into years, and soon the mine was deemed spent. Families left in waves, their wagons loaded with what little they could salvage. Those who remained clung to whatever scraps of livelihood they could find. The streets that had once rung with children's laughter grew quiet, and the marketplace shrank to a handful of stalls. Marta saw it all from a distance, her days spent tending a meager garden and doing odd sewing jobs when neighbors remembered her existence. The evenings were the hardest. When the sun dipped below the hills and the town's few lamps flickered weakly against the dark, Marta would sit on her porch and listen to the quiet. It was then that memories pressed hardest, reminding her of nights when John would come home covered in coal dust, his laughter rich and full, his arms eager to sweep her into a weary embrace. Now there was only the creak of her rocking chair and the rasp of the wind. She had grown used to being invisible. People pitied her, whispered about the poor widow, but they rarely invited her into their circles. To them, she was a shadow, a reminder of what they had lost themselves. It was on one of those dusky evenings, with the chill settling over the land and the first stars blinking awake, that Marta noticed movement near the gate. At first, she thought it was a fox nosing through the weeds, but then she saw the outline of a dog. It staggered as it walked, ribs pressing against ragged fur, one side marked with patches of raw skin where hair had burned away. The animal paused, lifted its head, and for a moment its eyes locked on hers. There was nothing wild in that gaze, nothing feral. It was steady, intelligent, almost imploring. Marta's first instinct was to turn away. She had no food to spare, no patience for another burden. Her larder was nearly bare as it was, and she barely managed to feed herself from the potatoes and carrots she grew behind the house. Yet the dog did not leave. It lowered itself to the dirt near her steps, curling its thin body as if it had finally reached where it was meant to be. Marta rose slowly, her hands brushing her apron, and approached with caution. The closer she came, the more she saw the scars along its flank, the limp in its back leg, and the worn leather of its collar. She thought of shooing it away, clapping her hands or stamping her feet, but when she did so gently, the dog only laid its head on its paws, unflinching. The collar caught her attention. It was old, cracked with age, but still bore faint letters. She squinted in the fading light, but could not yet make them out. She shook her head, muttering that she had no place for strays, yet her chest ached at the sight. The dog's breathing was shallow, its body trembling from exhaustion. Marta went back inside, convinced she would harden her heart, but as she sat at her table, staring at the single loaf of bread she had been saving, guilt pressed on her. She tore off a piece, more than she could afford to give, and returned to the porch. The dog's ears pricked, and when she held out the food, it rose unsteadily and ate with careful, delicate bites, as though afraid to offend. "Just this once," Marta whispered to herself, though the words rang hollow. The animal licked her hand, then sank back to the ground, its eyes closing as if finally safe enough to sleep. That night, Marta could not rest. She lay awake, listening to the dog's breathing just beyond her door. It was strange to feel another presence so near, strange to know she was not entirely alone. The silence of her home, which had once felt like a tomb, now seemed softer. She dreamed of John, of his strong hands and warm voice, and when she woke, her eyes were wet. She rose early, fed the dog scraps of boiled potato, and told herself it would leave by morning. But it did not. Day after day, the dog remained. It followed her to the well, trailed her as she weeded the garden, and waited outside the general store when she went into town. People noticed, of course. Whispers followed her more than before. Some laughed that the widow had finally found company in a mangy beast. Others shook their heads and muttered that it was bad luck to take in strays. Marta ignored them, though part of her feared they might be right. Yet every time she looked into the dog's eyes, she saw not trouble, but a strange sense of knowing, as if it had chosen her for a reason. Her life had not changed in any material sense. She was still poor, still overlooked, still fighting for survival. But the dog altered the rhythm of her days. Its loyalty, silent and unyielding, gave her something she had not felt in years: purpose. She began to wonder where it had come from, how it had survived its injuries, why it had limped straight to her gate. The collar nagged at her memory, though the letters were still too worn to decipher clearly. When she traced them with her fingers one afternoon, her heart quickened. The first letter looked like a J. The second could have been an M. She dropped the collar as if burned, unable to continue. The days shortened, autumn deepening around Copper Hollow. The garden withered, and Marta stored what little she could. The townsfolk grew quieter still, some leaving altogether, others retreating into their homes. Hunger and despair gnawed at everyone. Through it all, the dog stayed by her side, limping but never wavering, its eyes always lifting toward the distant hills, where the mine's black mouth gaped like a wound. At first, Marta thought little of it, but as the weeks passed, she could not shake the feeling that the animal was trying to tell her something. It would sit for long stretches, gazing toward that place, then look back at her with quiet insistence. She resisted the thought. The mine was her greatest fear, the grave of her happiness. She had avoided it for years, unwilling to face the memories it carried. Yet each day the dog's pull grew stronger, its intent clearer. Marta began to dream of the mine again, of John's voice calling from the dark, of echoes that refused to fade. And when she woke, the dog would be there, waiting, its eyes reflecting the same shadows that haunted her sleep. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Marta stood at her porch and looked to the hills. The wind carried the faint scent of coal and dust, a smell she had tried to forget. The dog rose to its feet and gave a soft whine, stepping toward the path that led out of town. Marta's heart pounded. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered to the empty air, "Not tonight." But even as she said it, she knew the moment was coming when she would have to follow. The town had forgotten her, but the dog had not. It had found her, chosen her, and its patience was running out. Something waited in the shadows of the mine, and Marta, whether ready or not, would soon be forced to face it. The dog did not leave with the morning. Marta had expected to wake and find the patch of dirt by her porch empty. But when she stepped outside, the animal was still there, its head lifted, eyes fixed on her, as though awaiting instructions. The sight stirred something in her chest, a mixture of annoyance and an ache she could not name. She had told herself the scraps she had given it the night before would be the first and last offering. Yet when she reached into her larder and found only a few potatoes and a heel of bread, she broke off a piece and carried it outside without thinking. The dog ate slowly, careful as always, never snapping or showing greed, as if it knew she could not spare much. Days stretched into weeks, and what had begun as an inconvenience became a quiet rhythm. Marta found herself speaking aloud more than she had in years, not to herself as before, but to the dog that followed her everywhere. She would mutter about the weather, curse at the stubborn weeds in her garden, and sometimes even tell stories of John, though she often stopped halfway through, her voice catching. The dog never responded beyond the tilt of its head or the swish of its tail, but its presence softened the silence that had pressed so heavily on her for so long. Still, there was something uncanny about the animal. It seemed too deliberate, too knowing. When she went to fetch water from the well at the edge of town, it walked ahead of her, then waited with patient eyes until she filled her buckets. When she walked into town for flour or thread, the dog trailed behind her, ignoring the muttered remarks of passers-by. Some laughed, calling her the widow with the ghost hound. Others shook their heads, warning that strays carried bad luck, but Marta paid them no mind. She had long since ceased to care what the town thought of her. What unsettled her more was the direction in which the dog's attention so often strayed. Whenever they stood outside, its gaze would drift toward the distant hills, where the black mouth of the mine yawned against the sky. At first she dismissed it as coincidence, yet it became impossible not to notice that whenever she paused in her chores, she would find the dog standing still, staring toward that place with quiet intensity. Sometimes it would whine, soft and low, before glancing back at her with an expression she could not interpret, but which filled her with unease. Marta had avoided the mine ever since the accident. Even passing near the path that led there was enough to make her chest tighten. That place was not just a wound in the earth, but in her life. It had taken John and with him all that she had been. To think of returning, even in thought, made her stomach knot. Yet the dog seemed determined to draw her toward it, its insistence growing with each passing day. One afternoon, while mending a torn shirt by the hearth, Marta felt the dog nudge her leg. She looked down, expecting it to beg for food, but instead it fixed her with a steady gaze, then padded toward the door. When she did not rise, it returned, nudged her again, and whined softly. She tried to ignore it, but it grew more insistent, pawing at the door, looking back at her, tail stiff. With a sigh, Marta set aside her needle and followed, telling herself she would humor the animal. The path it chose was unmistakable. The dog moved slowly, favoring its injured leg, but with determination. It led her through the outskirts of town, past houses with shuttered windows and empty yards, until the land began to slope upward toward the hills. The air grew cooler, the silence heavier, as though the earth itself held its breath. Marta's chest grew tight, and halfway up the incline she stopped, her knees trembling. "No farther," she whispered, though the dog could not understand her words. Or perhaps it did, for it turned back, its eyes filled with a strange patience, and walked at her side until they returned home. That night, Marta could not sleep. She lay awake listening to the steady breathing outside her door and thought of John. His face came to her as it had in the early days after his death, not blurred by time but sharp with memory. She remembered the nights when he had spoken of the mine, of the dangers he faced, of his determination to provide no matter the risk. He had carried secrets too, she realized now, things he had never shared with her, perhaps to spare her worry. The thought pricked at her heart. She turned on her side, and through the window she saw the silhouette of the dog against the starlit sky, watching, always watching. The collar continued to trouble her. On the third morning after she had first noticed the faint letters, she examined it again in the clear light of day. The leather was cracked, but when she rubbed the surface with her thumb, the markings grew clearer. J.M. Her breath caught. It could be nothing anyone's initials, yet her mind refused to let go of the possibility. John Morrison. Her John. She staggered back, nearly dropping the collar, her throat tight with disbelief. The dog watched her, head tilted, as if aware of her realization. Marta pressed a hand to her chest, whispering to herself that it was impossible. John's dog had vanished the day of the accident, never seen again. Some had said it perished in the collapse with him. Others claimed it had wandered off, lost in the hills. To imagine this animal was the same felt like reaching for a ghost. And yet, how else to explain the initials, the strange insistence, the way it had found its way to her doorstep after all these years? The days that followed were heavy with indecision. Marta tried to focus on her chores, on mending and tending the garden, but her thoughts circled endlessly. The dog continued to gaze toward the mine, as though reminding her that something remained unfinished. Each time she caught it staring, She felt a coldness seep into her bones, the weight of a choice she had not yet made. She found herself standing at her porch in the evenings, her eyes drawn toward the hills despite herself. The dog would sit beside her, silent and steady, as though waiting for her to gather the courage she lacked. One evening, when the sky burned orange with sunset and shadows stretched long across the fields, Marta felt something within her break. She could not live forever in the margins of her own life, hiding from the place that had stolen everything. The dog rose as she did, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Her heart pounded as she stepped off the porch, her feet carrying her toward the road that wound out of town. The animal padded ahead, its limp more pronounced in the fading light, yet its pace unwavering. They did not reach the mine that night. Marta's legs gave out halfway, her breath ragged with fear, and she sank to her knees. The dog circled her once, then lay at her side, pressing its warm body against her trembling frame. She buried her face in her hands, shame and dread warring within her. She could not yet face the dark mouth of that place, but she knew, as surely as she knew her own name, that she would return. The dog would not let her run forever, and perhaps, deep down, she did not truly want to. The following morning she awoke with a heaviness that felt different from grief. It was the weight of inevitability. The dog met her eyes as she stepped outside, and for the first time she did not look away. Something bound them now, something greater than pity or companionship. It was as though the animal carried a piece of John's spirit, a tether pulling her toward a truth long buried. Marta wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and whispered to the dog, "Not today, but soon." The dog seemed to understand. It sat quietly, gazing once more toward the mine, and Marta, for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of a resolve she had thought lost forever. The nights grew colder, and with them Marta's restlessness deepened. She had promised herself, and even spoken aloud to the dog, that she would go soon. The word soon carried her through the days, gave her a sense of direction, though she still trembled at the thought of setting foot in the place that had devoured her husband. The animal no longer tried to tug her forward at every chance. Instead it waited, patient as stone, as if it knew the moment must be hers to choose. And in time, the choice came as naturally as breathing. It was early morning when she finally tied her shawl tighter, filled a small flask with water, and slipped an old lantern into her basket. The dog rose at once, as though it had been listening for the sound of her resolve. Its limp was still visible, but its pace quickened with a strange anticipation, and Marta followed. The road out of town was silent. No one rose so early anymore, not when the hunger of another day pressed heavier than the promise of labor. The abandoned homes they passed stood hollow-eyed, their shutters creaking faintly in the breeze. Marta felt the emptiness of the world closing in on her, and yet beside her, the dog's steady presence kept her feet moving. The climb to the hills was steeper than she remembered. Every breath seemed to scrape her lungs. Every step churned up memories she had buried deep. She could almost hear John's voice drifting back from those long walks they once shared, when he would tell her about the workings of the mine, about veins of coal and stone, about men who had labored side by side beneath the earth for generations. She had never truly understood the language of miners, but she had loved listening, loved the way his eyes shone when he spoke of discovery, even in such grim conditions. Now those echoes taunted her. At last the mine came into view, its black maw gaping against the slope, framed by weather-beaten timbers that sagged under years of neglect. Weeds choked the path, and piles of stone lay where they had been abandoned, tools rusting beneath layers of dust and moss. Marta's heart raced. She had not seen this place since the day John's body had been carried out, wrapped in rough canvas, his face hidden. The world seemed to tilt around her, grief rising in waves so strong she nearly turned back. But the dog walked forward without hesitation, stopping only to glance at her, urging her onward. She lit her lantern with shaking hands. The flame flickered, casting narrow beams into the darkness as she stepped inside. The air was cooler, sharp with the scent of damp earth and old iron. Each footfall echoed in the hollow corridors, stirring the dust of years past. Marta felt as though she were trespassing into the grave of her own heart. The dog padded ahead, ears twitching, nose to the ground, its tail stiff with focus. The first chamber bore the scars of the collapse. Support beams splintered, rocks strewn across the floor, jagged wounds in the walls. She remembered the day it had fallen, the frantic shouts of rescuers, the endless digging that had yielded so little hope. She pressed her hand against the cold wall, steadying herself. The mine groaned faintly as though resentful of her intrusion, but she forced her legs to carry her deeper. As they moved, Marta noticed something strange. Amid the dust and ruin, faint impressions dotted the ground marks of boots not yet worn away by time. Her lantern beam caught the outline of a half-burnt torch discarded against a wall, its char still fresh. Someone had been here recently. She crouched, fingers trembling, as she traced the print of a heel pressed firmly into the dirt. Not weeks, not months, but days. The realization struck her like ice. The dog whined softly, then moved ahead with renewed certainty. Marta followed into a narrower passage, one she did not recall John ever mentioning. It sloped downward, the air growing colder, the silence denser. Her lantern sputtered as though resisting the depth. And then, at the end of the tunnel, she saw it, a wooden barrier hastily built, planks nailed across the rock. At first she thought it a dead end, but the dog pushed its nose against a gap, sniffing intently. Marta raised the lantern and saw the boards were loose. Her heart thundered as she pried at them, splinters digging into her palms until one came free, then another, until a hole wide enough for her body yawned before her. Inside lay a hidden chamber, untouched by collapse. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of oil and stone, but the sight that greeted her banished all hesitation. A rough table stood in the center, its surface cluttered with papers, maps spread neatly across, samples of rock in small labeled jars. Lanterns and tools leaned against the wall, their metal faintly polished. This was no forgotten relic. This place was alive with intent. Marta stepped forward, eyes wide, her lantern trembling in her grasp. She reached for one of the maps, her breath catching as she recognized the detail, the precision. These were surveys of the Earth's veins, hand-drawn with practiced skill. Red ink traced a winding path leading northwest, ending in a bold X. Beside it, notes scrawled in tidy script spoke of mineral deposits, of water seams, of untapped wealth beneath the soil. Marta's chest tightened. She might not understand the full meaning of the diagrams, but she knew enough to see what they implied. The mine was not empty. Beneath their feet lay riches enough to save the town. Her hand brushed against another page, and her vision blurred. The handwriting was unmistakable, though faded with time. John's. He had been here. These were his markings, his words left in the days before his death. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto a stool, clutching the paper to her chest. For years she had believed he was swallowed without warning, a victim of cruel chance. But now, staring at his familiar hand, she realized he had known something, carried a truth that perhaps cost him his life. The dog lay in a patch of light cast by her lantern, watching her with calm, knowing eyes. Marta could not look away. It was as if John himself had guided her here, through this loyal creature, across years of silence and sorrow. She pressed her trembling lips to the paper and whispered his name, though the mind swallowed the sound. The moment of awe gave way to dread. If John had written these notes, if he had marked this path, then why had they remained hidden? Why had the town been left to rot while someone else clearly came here in secret? The fresh boot prints echoed in her mind. Someone knew of this place, someone who had continued John's work or stolen it. And if they had gone to such lengths to hide it, then she was in danger merely by standing here. Her lantern flame wavered as though warning her to leave. She stuffed one of the smaller maps into her basket, heart pounding, before dousing the light. Darkness swallowed her, but the dog pressed against her leg, guiding her back through the tunnel by instinct. Every creak of timber, every shuffle of rock threatened to betray her presence. When at last the faint glow of daylight appeared, she rushed forward, lungs burning with relief. Outside, the sun had already climbed, casting the hills in gold. Marta fell to her knees, clutching the map, gasping as though she had risen from deep water. The dog stood beside her, head high, tail lifted, triumphant. She looked at it with tears streaming down her cheeks, knowing the course of her life had shifted. The mine was not finished, nor was John's story. She had stumbled upon a secret powerful enough to change everything for her, for the town, for all who still clung to survival in Copper Hollow. But with the revelation came fear. If she had found it, then others already had. The thought chilled her blood. She rose unsteadily, hiding the paper in her shawl, and turned back toward the path home. Behind her the mine loomed. Not just a grave, but a keeper of secrets, waiting for the day they would no longer remain buried. Marta returned from the mine with the weight of the hidden map pressed against her chest. All the way down the slope, through the tangle of weeds and fallen stones, she clutched it as though it were John's very heart she carried, fragile and irreplaceable. The dog stayed close to her side, its gait limping but steady, its eyes never leaving her. When at last they reached the edge of town, the familiar sight of her house brought little comfort. Everything had changed within her since she had stepped into the hidden chamber. Knowledge sat heavy on her shoulders, knowledge that could rescue Copper Hollow from despair or plunge her into greater danger than she had ever imagined. That night she could not sleep. She lit her lantern low and spread the stolen map across her kitchen table, smoothing its creased edges with trembling hands. The ink marks stared back at her, precise lines that spoke of underground veins and rich seams, red notations that pointed towards something far more precious than coal. She saw the word water repeated in John's careful script, alongside references she could not fully understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. A source, abundant and pure, hidden beneath the earth. Her breath caught as she realized what it meant. While the town withered from drought, the lifeblood of survival waited only a few miles away. But if John had discovered it, why had no one known? Why had she and every other soul in Copper Hollow been left to suffer? The answer was cruelly simple. Someone had hidden the truth. Someone had turned John's work into a secret and stolen it for themselves. The boot prints in the dust, the fresh torch, the tidy order of that chamber, they were not the work of her husband but of another who had claimed his discovery. She thought of the wealth that would come from controlling water in a town so desperate. Whoever held that secret held power enough to bend the town to their will. And Marta now knew too much to be safe. The following morning she walked into town to fetch flour, her mind still haunted by what she had seen. As she moved through the narrow streets, she felt eyes on her. It was not unusual for whispers to follow the widow, but today the air carried a sharper edge. A man she did not recognize leaned against the corner of the tavern, his gaze lingering too long. Another stranger, broad-shouldered and dressed too finely for a place as worn as Copper Hollow, watched from the steps of the blacksmith's shop. Marta's skin prickled beneath their scrutiny. She kept her head down, bought what she needed, and hurried home, the dog pressing close against her skirts as though it too sensed the shift. That night she dreamed of fire. She dreamed of her house crackling with flames, of John's voice calling her name through smoke. She woke to the sound of the dog barking furiously, its body pressed against the door. Marta leapt to her feet, her heart pounding. Outside, the faint glow of embers lit the darkness. Someone had tossed a burning torch against the side of her shed, the dry wood catching quickly. She seized a bucket and raced to the well, dousing the flames before they could spread. By the time the fire was quenched, only charred boards and smoke remained. There was no sign of the culprits, only the echo of footsteps fading into the night. She sank onto the ground, trembling, the bucket clattering from her hands. The dog pressed its head against her arm, whining low. It was not an accident. Someone wanted to frighten her into silence, to drive her away from what she had found. Her fear curdled into anger. For years she had been invisible, too small to matter, too forgotten to pose any threat. Now, because of one hidden map, she was dangerous to men powerful enough to destroy her. In the days that followed, she began to notice more. The strangers lingered longer in town, their voices low and sharp when they thought she could not hear. Once, as she passed the general store, she caught a name hissed between them. Mr. Hawk. Her stomach twisted at the mention. She had heard the name whispered often enough. A wealthy man from the capital, Hawk had been buying up land across the valley, always arriving with a smile and an offer just when families were at their most desperate. Many had sold to him for pennies, believing he was doing them a kindness. But Marta now saw the darker truth. Hawk was the spider at the center of the web, the one who had taken John's discovery and turned it into a weapon. The dog seemed to share her unease. It stayed closer than ever, sleeping by her door at night, following her steps without pause. Its ears pricked at the slightest sound, its growls low when shadows passed too near. Once Marta thought of sending it away for its own safety, but the look in its eyes silenced the thought. It had led her to the truth, and it would not abandon her now. One afternoon, desperate for clarity, she returned to the mine. She told herself she would not linger, only search for more of John's handwriting, some sign that might explain what he had known. The dog guided her once more to the hidden chamber, its nose pressed to the boards as if it remembered every scent. She lit her lantern and stepped inside, her heart hammering with dread and hope alike. The table still bore maps and samples, but something was wrong. The order was disrupted. The careful arrangement she had seen before replaced with hasty disarray. Several jars were missing, as were the largest maps. Someone had been here since her last visit. Marta's pulse raced as she rifled through what remained. At the bottom of a stack, she found a smaller page, half torn, its edges smudged. It bore her husband's hand again, though hurried, as if written under pressure. The words were few but searing. If I do not return, it was no accident. Hawk insists on silence. Tell them. Marta's breath caught. Hawk's name, tied to John's final days, written in his own script. She pressed the page to her chest, her knees weak. Her husband had not simply died in a collapse. He had been silenced. The sound of shifting rocks startled her. She doused the lantern at once, plunging the chamber into darkness. Footsteps echoed down the tunnel, heavy and deliberate. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. Voices followed, low but distinct. Make sure everything is still here, one said. The old fool's notes are worth more than this whole town. Another voice replied, sharp and commanding. Hawk wants it all secured before the council gets wind. If anyone snoops around, we deal with them. Marta covered her mouth, struggling to steady her breathing. Through a crack in the boards, she saw the glow of another lantern, the shadows of two men crossing the chamber. They moved with practiced ease, gathering papers into satchels, muttering about deadlines and buyers. She recognized one of them, a man from town, a merchant who often shook hands with Hawk when he visited. Betrayal burned her throat. Hawk had allies here, neighbors who smiled by day and schemed by night. The dog pressed against her leg, trembling with tension but silent. Marta stroked its fur, begging it without words to stay quiet. Minutes stretched like hours until at last the men left, their boots fading into the distance. Only when the silence returned did she allow herself to breathe again. She slipped from the chamber, her hands tight around John's torn note, and fled into the light. By the time she reached home, dusk had fallen. The dog collapsed beside the porch, exhausted, while Marta sank to her knees inside, spreading the note across the table. The truth glared up at her in her husband's hand. Hawk's greed had killed him, and now Hawk's greed threatened to strangle Copper Hollow itself. The fire, the strangers, the stolen maps, all of it was part of a web closing around her. Fear gnawed at her, but alongside it burned a fierce resolve. For years she had been powerless, drifting like a ghost on the edges of her own life. Now she carried the one thing Hawk could not control, the truth. It was a fragile weapon, paper and ink. Yet it was all she had. The dog lifted its head, watching her with eyes that glowed in the lantern light, as if urging her onward. Marta laid her hand on its head, her voice steady though her heart shook. We'll finish what John began. The words hung in the air like a vow. She had entered the mine as a frightened widow, but she left it as something else. The conspiracy that had haunted Copper Hollow was no longer a secret to her. And though enemies circled like wolves, she knew she could not turn back. The battle for truth had already begun, and Marta was at its center. The days after her narrow escape from the mine blurred into one another, heavy with dread and a constant edge of vigilance. Marta barely slept, and when she did, her dreams came thick with images of John's face half hidden in shadow, his lips moving as if to warn her, but no sound reaching her. Each morning she awoke with the ache of unfinished words lodged in her chest. The torn note he had left behind lay beneath her pillow, and each time she touched it, she felt both courage and fear coiling within her. The dog, sensing the storm inside her, remained closer than ever. Its presence was a shield against despair, though even it could not still the pounding of her heart whenever footsteps sounded too near her door. The name Hawk had once been only a rumor, an echo of men speaking of a distant figure whose wealth stretched like invisible fingers into every valley. Now it had become the shape of her enemy. He was the one who had driven John to his death, silencing him before he could speak of the mine's hidden wealth. And it was Hawk's men who stalked her now, burning her shed, scouring the chambers, whispering threats into the wind. She could feel the noose tightening, yet for all her fear, Marta could not turn away. It was not only vengeance that drove her, but the memory of John's unfinished work. He had wanted the truth to live on beyond him, and now it lay in her hands. The dog grew restless as if stirred by the same urgency. It no longer lingered by the porch or slept as soundly as before. More often it would nose at her skirts until she rose, then pace to the road that led once more toward the mine. It seemed to insist that there was more left behind, something yet unseen. At first Marta resisted, shaken by how narrowly she had avoided discovery, but the thought gnawed at her each time she fingered the note. John had always been deliberate. If he had hidden one message, there might be others. The dog seemed certain of it. On the third evening, when the sun was slipping behind the hills and shadows bled long across the earth, Marta yielded. She wrapped her shawl tight and set out once more, the dog trotting at her side. The road was emptier than ever, as if even the town itself had grown too weary to stir. Her lantern flickered weakly as they reached the mine's mouth, its blackness gaping like an accusation. Her breath shuddered, but she forced herself forward. Inside, the silence wrapped around her like a shroud. Each echo of her steps seemed too loud, a betrayer ready to call the strangers back. Yet the dog pressed on with certainty, pausing only to sniff the ground before leading her deeper into the shafts. It did not guide her toward the chamber she had already found, but into a side passage half choked with fallen stone. Marta hesitated, fearing collapse, but the dog pushed through the gap and glanced back until she followed. The air grew colder, the darkness heavier, until at last they reached a dead end where the timbers had splintered. Marta thought they had come for nothing until the dog began to paw at a mound of rubble near the wall. She knelt beside it, brushing away dirt, and her finger struck wood. Her pulse quickened as she unearthed the corner of a small box wedged beneath the stones. With trembling effort, she dragged it free, coughing as dust filled the air. The box was plain, its hinges rusted, but when she pried it open, the breath fled her lungs. Inside lay a bundle of papers, tied together with fraying cord, their edges worn with handling. She lifted the top sheet and gasped. It was John's handwriting again, but more personal than the neat survey notes she had seen before. These were diary pages, dated from the weeks leading up to the collapse. The words told of his discovery that the mine still held not only veins of coal, but pockets of something greater, minerals of unusual quality, and most vitally, an underground aquifer vast enough to sustain not just Copper Hollow, but every settlement across the valley. He wrote of his excitement, his conviction that this discovery could rescue them all from ruin, but the tone shifted as the pages went on. John wrote of Hawk's interest, of meetings in hushed corners, where the wealthy man had pressed him to keep silent until land deeds could be acquired. He wrote of the unease that coiled in his gut each time Hawk smiled, of the way other men in town had begun to side with him, tempted by promises of profit. The last pages grew hurried, the script uneven. John confessed he feared an accident might befall him, that Hawk's patience was running out. "If I do not return," he had written in words that trembled across the page, "know that it was his hand, not chance, that ended me. Tell the people. They deserve the truth." Marta's tears blurred the ink. She pressed the pages to her chest, her sobs echoing against the stone. For years she had carried the weight of a widow abandoned by cruel fortune, and now the truth cut deeper than she had ever imagined. John had not merely died in an accident. He had been murdered by silence, swallowed by a conspiracy of greed. And in that knowledge was the spark of something she had not felt in years: resolve. She looked at the dog, its eyes reflecting the lantern's flame, and felt as though John himself were there, urging her to rise. Her grief had kept her prisoner, but his words freed her. She had been living as a shadow, but now she had a purpose clear as the ink on the page. Hawk had stolen her husband, stolen years of her life, but he would not steal the truth. The journey back from the mine felt different this time. The darkness no longer pressed so heavy, the echoes no longer taunted. Marta clutched the diary to her chest like a weapon, her steps quick despite her exhaustion. When she emerged into the cool night air, the stars burned bright above the hills, and for the first time she felt their light not as distant, but as a guide. At home she spread the diary on her table, reading and rereading until dawn painted the sky. Each word settled deeper into her bones, each line strengthening her resolve. She could no longer remain silent. She would finish what John had begun, no matter the cost. Fear still gnawed at her, but beneath it burned a fiercer flame. She was no longer just a widow on the outskirts of town. She was the keeper of John's truth, and she would not let it die with him. The dog lay beside her chair, its head resting on her foot, its breathing steady. Marta reached down and stroked its scarred fur, whispering softly, "We'll see this through, you and I." And in the animal's quiet gaze, she felt the echo of John's strength, as though he had entrusted his will to this creature, knowing one day it would lead her here. By the time the sun rose high, Marta had made her decision. She would no longer hide, no longer whisper the truth only to herself. Hawk's grip on Copper Hollow would not remain unchallenged. She had lived too long in silence, and silence had cost her everything. Now her voice, joined with John's words, would break the chains. The widow had become something more, a fighter, a witness, and perhaps, if fate allowed, the spark that would bring her town back from the brink. The road ahead would be dangerous, but Marta felt the weight of her fear lighten beneath the burden of her purpose. She rose, the diary in her hands, the dog at her side, and stepped toward the door. The battle for truth had begun, and she was ready to face it. The morning after Marta found John's diary, the world looked the same as it always had. The crooked fence sagged against the weight of time, the garden struggled to produce life from barren soil, and the dusty road carried no more footsteps than before. Yet to her, everything was altered. The words she had read by lantern light had cut a line straight through her fear and grief. Hawk's shadow no longer seemed distant and faceless. It had a name, a hand that had stolen her husband, a hand that now reached for the very heart of Copper Hollow. She had lived too long in silence, but silence was what Hawk counted on, and silence was what had buried John. No more. Still, the enormity of her task pressed against her like a millstone. Who would believe her? A widow who spoke little, who lived on scraps at the edge of town, who had no standing among the men who gathered in the tavern or the council meetings. She imagined their smirks, their dismissive glances, the muttered words about hunger driving her mad. And yet she had John's diary, the maps, the proof. She could not keep them locked away in her house like relics. The people had to know. She began cautiously. On the second day, she approached Mrs. Holloway, a woman whose husband had died in the same collapse. Marta laid the torn note on the table between them, her voice trembling as she spoke of Hawk's hand in John's death. Mrs. Holloway's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head, fear etched deep in her face. "You don't know what men like him can do," she whispered. "Keep quiet, for your own sake." Marta left with her heart heavy, but not broken. She had expected resistance. Fear had kept Copper Hollow bowed for years. The next attempt was with Thomas Reed, a farmer who had lost his land when Hawk bought it for pennies. Marta showed him the map, pointed to the X marked in John's hand. Reed studied it long, his rough fingers tracing the ink, but in the end he too pushed it away. "Looks like nonsense to me," he said, "and even if it isn't, Hawk owns half the valley. He'll swallow the rest before long. Best to keep your head down, widow." His words stung, but she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a spark he tried to smother. Night after night, Marta returned to the diary, drawing strength from John's words, reminding herself why she could not stop. And through it all, the dog was with her, lying by the door when strangers passed, following her to town, watching every face with wary suspicion. Once, when she left the store, she saw two of Hawk's men at the far end of the street, their eyes sharp, their smiles thin. The dog growled low, the sound vibrating against her leg. Fear gnawed at her, but anger steadied her steps. It was the fire that broke her hesitation. One night near midnight, she woke to the crackle of flames. This time it was not her shed, but her very house they had set alight, torches thrown against the porch. She ran into the night, bucket in hand, coughing as smoke clawed her throat. The dog barked wildly, dashing through the yard, until together they managed to quench the blaze before it consumed everything. When the last embers hissed into darkness, Marta collapsed against the fence, her lungs burning, her eyes stinging. She had no illusions left. Hawk's men would not stop with warnings. If she stayed silent, they would snuff her out like the fire they had tried to kindle. At dawn, she made her decision. She would speak to them all, not one by one, not in whispers, but openly, where Hawk's shadow could not smother her words. The next market day, when the townsfolk gathered to barter what little they had, Marta stepped into the square with the diary clutched in her hands. The dog pressed against her skirts, its presence a steadying weight. For a moment she faltered, the eyes of the crowd turning toward her, skeptical, surprised. She was not one of the speakers, not one of the strong voices that guided the town. She was the widow on the outskirts. Yet when she opened the diary and held it high, her voice came strong. "These are my husband's words," she said, the square falling into uneasy silence. "You believe the mine took him, that he died with the others in the collapse? But it was no accident. He wrote that if he did not return, it would be Hawk's doing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, disbelief mixing with unease. She opened to the last pages, reading aloud the lines where John spoke of the aquifer, of Hawk's insistence on silence, of his fear that his discovery would be twisted into greed. Her voice shook, but she pressed on, louder as the faces leaned closer. "There is water beneath us, enough to save Copper Hollow, and Hawk has hidden it, buying your land for pennies while your children thirst." A man in the crowd laughed bitterly. "And we're to take the word of a lonely widow?" His mockery struck like a whip, but before Marta could answer, others shouted back. "If it's true, then why are Hawk's men sniffing around? Why is he buying up every farm?" Another voice rose, fierce with anger. "My brother died in that collapse. If it wasn't an accident—" The square erupted with clamor, voices tangling between outrage and doubt. Marta stood firm, clutching the diary, her eyes burning with tears. She had cracked the silence. Then the interruption came. Hawk's men pushed through the crowd, broad-shouldered, armed, their faces twisted with contempt. One seized the diary from her hands, sneering as he waved it. "This is nothing but scribbles. The widow's gone mad." The townsfolk gasped, but Marta lunged, snatching it back with a cry. "These are his word!" she shouted. The dog bared its teeth, snapping at the man's boots until he retreated with a curse. The moment of violence shifted the air. Fear melted into fury. The people had long been bent under Hawk's control, but now they saw its hand laid bare. Shouts grew louder, calls for justice, demands for truth. Someone grabbed Marta's arm and pulled her toward the council hall, urging her to show them, to let the leaders decide. The crowd followed, a tide of voices rising. Inside the hall, the councilmen shifted uneasily, unused to such uproar. Marta spread the diary and the maps across their table, her voice hoarse but unyielding as she told them of John's discovery, of Hawk's pressure, of the men she had seen in the mine. She laid bare her grief, her fear, and her rage, every word sharpened by the fire that had nearly consumed her home. The dog sat at her side, silent but fierce, as though guarding not only her, but the truth itself. The council argued, some scoffing, others growing pale as they read John's handwriting. One tried to dismiss it, but another slammed a fist on the table. "If even half of this is true, Hawk has lied to us all. He let us suffer while he planned to sell us back our own salvation." Murmurs swelled into roars outside the hall as the people waited. The decision was no longer the council's alone. The town itself had heard Marta's words, and the town had woken from its long silence. When she stepped back into the square, the air crackled with anger and resolve. She no longer stood invisible. Neighbors who had once passed her by without a glance now reached for her hands, their eyes filled with gratitude and fire. She had given them a voice, and with it the strength to stand. Hawk's men retreated from the square under the glare of dozens of eyes, their power fractured by the weight of truth. That night, Marta sat at her table, the diary before her, the dog asleep at her feet. She was exhausted, her body trembling from the strain, but within her heart a fierce calm had taken root. For the first time in years she had spoken and been heard. For the first time since John's death, she no longer felt alone. Yet she knew this was only the beginning. Hawk would not surrender so easily. He would strike back with lies, with violence, with every tool wealth could buy. But now the town had risen, and she was no longer a shadow among them. She was their witness, their spark, their rallying cry. As she leaned back, her hand resting on the dog's warm flank, she whispered into the quiet room, "We've begun, John. They know now." And in the silence that followed, she felt as though the very walls of her home held their breath, waiting for the next step in a battle that had only just started. The fire of voices that had risen in the square did not die with the night. Long after Marta returned to her house, the echo of the townsfolk's fury carried through Copper Hollow like a storm cresting over the hills. She had lain awake, John's diary beside her, the dogs breathing steady at her feet, and listened as the murmurs outside her window grew into something larger, something fierce. For the first time in years, the people had found their voices, and it was her words, her husband's words, that had given them shape. Yet she knew, as the darkness pressed against her walls, that Hawk would not vanish quietly. He was a man of wealth and cunning, and such men clung to their schemes like roots to dry earth. The battle was not yet finished. The following morning brought no peace. A gathering swelled at the council hall before dawn, the square packed with weary faces lined with hunger and hardened by anger. Marta stood among them, her shawl pulled tightly against the morning chill, the diary cradled in her arms as though it were a child. The dog stayed close, its head low, its eyes scanning the crowd with an alertness that seemed more human than animal. When the councilmen appeared, the voices rose again, demanding answers, demanding Hawk be called to account. No longer could his name be spoken only in whispers. Word came swiftly that Hawk had fled the town in the night, his men scattering in his wake. Some had ridden west with saddlebags heavy, others vanished into the hills. The betrayal was complete. The council declared openly that Marta's evidence was to be preserved, that Hawk would be pursued and held to answer for his crimes. But Marta knew better than to think such men fell easily. He had gone not to disappear, but to regroup, to spread lies to officials who did not know the truth of Copper Hollow. If he reached the capital, he might twist the story to his favor, claim the aquifer as his discovery, and turn the law itself into his weapon. It was Clara Holloway, a sharp-eyed woman whose husband had also died in the mine, who first voiced what Marta had already feared. "If we don't stop him before he reaches the governor, everything we've fought for will be undone." The council muttered, unsure, but the people around them cried agreement. Hawk was clever, and Hawk was fast. To wait was to lose. Riders would have to follow. Marta felt her hand rise before she realized what she was doing. She had never stood at the front of anything in her life, but now her voice carried. "I will ride with you," she said. The square stilled for a moment, eyes turning toward her in disbelief, but she did not falter. "John gave his life for this truth. I will not see it stolen again." The silence broke with a murmur of assent, then shouts of support. She was no longer the widow at the edge of town. She was their witness, their proof, their strength. By noon, a small posse had formed, Clara with her rifle, 2 ranch hands hardened by loss, and a pair of young men who knew the trails better than most. Marta mounted a borrowed horse, the diary bound in oilskin and tied securely to her side. The dog trotted alongside, limping but unyielding, its loyalty as certain as the sun. They rode west, the town watching them go with a mixture of fear and hope. The future of Copper Hollow balanced on their departure. The trail was long and unforgiving. Dust clung to their throats, the sun burned their backs, and the land stretched in dry, endless waves. Yet they pressed on, spurred by the knowledge that Hawk had only a day's lead. By late afternoon they found his tracks, the prints of a horse burdened with weight, deep and distinct in the dry riverbed. The dog sniffed the ground, growling low, and set off at a determined pace. They followed until the pass narrowed between cliffs, the air cooler in the shadows. There they saw him. Hawk stood beside his horse, refilling a canteen from a trickle of water that seeped from the rock. His coat was fine, his boots polished, even here in the wilderness. For a moment, when he looked up and saw them, the mask cracked. Fear flickered across his face before he replaced it with a smooth smile. "Well," he drawled, "if it isn't Copper Hollow's bravest. Come to thank me for securing your future?" His words dripped with false charm, but his eyes darted toward the saddlebags, heavy with stolen maps and samples. Clara's rifle leveled on him, her voice sharp. "No more lies, Hawk. We know everything." Marta felt her stomach tighten as his gaze fixed on her, narrowing with recognition. "The widow," he sneered. "Always thought you were harmless. I should have finished with you when I had the chance." His words struck like a lash, but she held his gaze. Her voice, though trembling, rang steady. "You let children thirst while you planned to sell us back our own water. John tried to stop you, and you killed him for it. But his words live, his truth lives, and the town stands with me now." For a moment silence hung heavy, broken only by the drip of water against stone. Hawk's hand twitched toward his holster, the smile slipping from his face. "You think you can stop me with a scrap of paper?" he hissed. "The governor is mine. By the time you drag me back, the law will be mine as well." His hand moved quick, but Clara was quicker. Her rifle cracked, the sound ricocheting against the cliffs. Hawk staggered, eyes wide with disbelief, his hand clawing at his chest where blood bloomed dark across his coat. He fell against the rock, his pistol slipping from his grasp, his fine clothes torn and stained by the dust of the riverbed. The posse stood frozen, the echo of the shot ringing in their ears. Marta felt her breath seize in her chest, her hands trembling as Hawk's body stilled. He had been a shadow looming over them all, a terror too vast to name. Now he lay at her feet, smaller than she had imagined, stripped of power, just another man who had thought himself untouchable. Clara lowered her rifle, her face carved from stone. "He made his choice," she said simply. They buried Hawk where he fell, beneath a cairn of rocks, unmarked and unremembered. His horse and saddlebags they turned back toward Copper Hollow. The stolen maps and samples returned to the people he had sought to rob. As they rode home, dusk painted the sky with fire and gold, the weight of what had passed pressing on them all. Marta rode in silence, the diary still bound at her side, the dog limping beside her horse, its eyes never leaving her. News of Hawk's death spread swiftly, but it was the diary and the confession it contained that mattered most. The council declared the aquifer the rightful property of the town, a gift of the earth meant for all, not the prize of a single man's greed. Work began at once, men and women laboring together with picks and shovels, guided by John's maps. Marta stood among them, her hands blistered, her back aching, yet her heart lighter than it had been in years. When at last water burst through the earth in a gush that sparkled in the lantern light, the town erupted in cheers, laughter, and tears mingling as they drank from cupped hands. Marta knelt among them, the dog lapping eagerly at the stream, and felt as though John himself had reached across the years to bless them. The weeks that followed transformed Copper Hollow. Barrels filled, troughs overflowed, crops sprouted green once more. The laughter of children returned to the streets, and neighbors who had once averted their eyes from Marta now sought her counsel, thanking her for her courage. The council granted her a small stipend and a post of honor. Keeper of the survey maps, guardian of John's legacy. For the first time since his death, she felt she belonged not as a shadow on the edge of gatherings, but as a part of the town's heart. One warm evening, Marta stood by the new well at the center of the square, watching children splash at its edge, their laughter rising into the twilight. The dog lay at her feet, its once wounded leg healed enough to chase the little ones when they teased it with scraps. Clara came to stand beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You saved this town," she said softly. Marta shook her head, her eyes shining. "I only followed where the dog led." Clara smiled knowingly. "Sometimes it takes a lonely soul to see what the rest of us overlook." As the stars blossomed across the sky, Marta looked out over Copper Hollow, faces no longer hollow with thirst, Gardens green, children with water dripping down their chins. She felt warmth in her chest she had not known in years. Belonging. Purpose. The widow who had once drifted invisible on the margins had found her place not through pity, but through courage. She looked down at the dog, its eyes half closed in contentment, and whispered a quiet thanks not only to the creature who had guided her, but to John, whose truth had endured beyond death, and to the town that had finally seen her not as a shadow, but as one of their own. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next tale of survival, betrayal, and courage. Click on the video on your screen to watch another gripping story that will shock you even more. And if you want to help us grow, share this video with your friends and family. Let them discover the truth hidden in stories they'll never forget.